Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to how the East Coast and West Coast compare. Now, this should be an interesting video because the East Coast is like from, I think it's New York, like Massachusetts. I'm trying to imagine the US. Florida's at the bottom, and I think Florida's part of the South. So I think, is Chicago in the East Coast as well? But then the West Coast, you've got California, and that's just it's a behemoth. I think California has the highest GDP per state of all the states in the US. And you've also got, I think Arizona is on the West Coast too. And what's underneath? I don't know, but there's real economic powerhouses in both coasts. But which one comes out on top? Because obviously I think California is the most financially prosperous state. But then if you combine, New York, which has the stock exchange, and, Massachusetts, I don't know, which one? So this video here is going to help me answer that question. It's going to be fun. Let's do it.
East versus West. A while back, I did a video comparing the two sides of Germany. Even though the country reunited in the late 20th century, many factors still point out deep differences between the two sides of the country. This got me thinking, which other countries have big differences between regions? In this video, we're going to be comparing two regions of the United States, the East versus the West coasts.
Let's go.
First, it's important to point out that the two coasts are, together, the most developed and rich regions of the country. When you compare each or the two together with the country's interior, the numbers speak for themselves. The biggest example is population, with the vast majority living in these areas.
Coasts.
But comparing the coasts with the interior would be a little boring because the coasts would do better in pretty much all factors. So I want to take into account the two of them and answer the question, how do the East and West coasts of the US compare? The first differences we should take into account are, I think, geographical and territorial ones. As the name indicates, the West Coast is in the West and the East is in the East. The East Coast borders the Atlantic Ocean and Canada, while the West borders the Pacific Ocean, Canada, but also Mexico. Being 3 hours ahead, the East Coast technically has 14 states, very closely related to the initial 13 colonies that rebelled against the British and first established the United States.
Okay, so we have New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia. Okay, I forgot about these. I would have thought these would be the South. I guess, are they still part of the South? Surely Georgia's still considered the South, right?
Exception, among others, being Florida, which was still Spanish at the time. For this video, I chose to include Pennsylvania and Vermont, making the total of the East Coast 16. I know they're not on the East Coast itself, but it makes sense to me to include them on this list. While the West Coast only has 3 states, some people include Nevada and Arizona in their West Coast concept, but I didn't in this video. And the official West Coast is also made up of Alaska and Hawaii, which I equally didn't include. Interestingly, all of Florida is further south than California. I don't think we can really get this perception when looking at maps. When it comes to size and population, the size of the East Coast is over 1 million square kilometers, made up of the states of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina.
This really surprises me still. I would never have, I know I've said it already, but they just don't seem East Coast to me at all. They seem south.
Georgia, and Florida, and its population is around 130 million, almost 40% of the United States total population. The West Coast size is smaller at 863,000 square kilometers. Now, it is smaller, but not that much smaller, which means that these 3 states are much bigger than many of the other 16, and its population is around 50 million, less than half, almost only 1/3 of the East Coast's, only 15% of the country's total. It's interesting that the sizes aren't that different, with the East only being slightly bigger, but much more populated, showing us how population density in the East is much higher than the West.
I guess that's why buying a place is so, really expensive, I imagine, in the East Coast, especially places like New York and New Jersey. I think those are really expensive. But California is also expensive too, at least LA.
This map of population density demonstrates that there's a lot more green areas in the West. The whole eastern area of the country is much more populated even. There's only a few urban areas in the middle and west of the country on almost a single strip of high density land in the West Coast. This likely has to do with the fact that the East was colonized first, and expansion moved in the direction of east to west. First the 13 colonies, then the territory ceded by the British, then the Louisiana Purchase, and then the Mexican
looking at how it got broken up and divided over time.
Cessions. This also justifies another difference between the coasts, which is the existence of older cities and structures. Universities, for instance, are much older in the East Coast, with some dating to the 18th century. California is the only US state in the West that was settled earlier than the rest, but still later than the whole of the East. When it comes to temperature, it varies somewhat equally as you go north and south of each of the coasts. The north is colder and the south is warmer. However, even if temperatures are similar, the weather types are different. In this map, we can see the Köppen climate types in each region. The Köppen climate classification is one of the most widely used systems, first published by German-Russian climatologist Vladimir Köppen in 1884. It divides climates into 5 main climate groups, with each group being divided based on seasonal precipitation and temperature patterns. Here we can see California is mostly Mediterranean type weather, Oregon is the same but less warm, while Washington is more oceanic. In the East Coast, the north is warm, humid, continental, with the rest being closer to subtropical, although these colors are a little confusing. Before we move on with the video, a quick message.
It's kind of interesting because I always thought that California was super hot year round. But apparently it's quite temperate and, it doesn't really get crazy hot.
Now, back to the video. We've looked at climate, weather, land, territory, organization, and population. So now, how do these people live in those areas? Politically, people on both coasts tend to be more progressive than the interior areas of the country. However, as you go further south in each of them, more conservatism also shows up. The states on the northeast coast are, in my opinion, some of the most progressive in the US, but California itself is as well. The whole of the West Coast has Democratic governors, which are also common in the Northeast, while the majority of the East Coast has Republicans as governors, results that are similar in other types of elections. Economically, the West is more of a center for technological companies and new startups, while the East is more the financial center of the country, especially up north. The unemployment rate is something that changes all the time, but right now it seems pretty balanced between the two coasts. Regarding the GDP, in this map,
I imagine a lot of people move to both of the coasts for like economic opportunities as well. Probably a lot of jobs and stuff, and you probably earn higher wages, I would imagine, in both coasts.
By friend and partner of the channel, Statista, we can see the contribution each state makes, percentage-wise, for the national GDP. We can instantly tell that the East Coast has a higher GDP percentage than the West. Again, 14-something states versus 3 is normal to be the case. But we must pay attention to California, with a GDP almost equivalent to the whole country of the United Kingdom, being the highest in the country and contributing 14%.
Well, we are a lot smaller, so
percent to the national value over New York and Florida combined. When it comes to HDI, the northeast coast is the most developed of the entire country, while all the west coast does pretty well too. The south, which also reaches into the east coast, is the area that does less well. Regarding salary, median monthly earnings are like this. The same thing happens. The north has a higher median income than the south in both coasts. The southern part of the east coast is the one with the lowest income. This is per household and not individual, by the way. But making a lot of money doesn't mean that much if the cost of living is immense.
This is true. Prime example being in London.
Salaries in New York might be higher, but so is the cost to rent an apartment. This map shows us the average cost of living, and in it we can see that in all of the west coast plus the northeast coast, the cost of living is over 100, which I think means on average it takes more to live than you can earn every month. But besides all these economic indicators, it's also important to take a look at the income inequality. Maybe there's a lot of money being made, but most of it is concentrated on a very small minority of the population. This map shows us that information. The Gini index is only reasonable in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. None of the west coast is in the green either, with only Washington being okay in the yellow. Back in the east coast, New York, Connecticut are the worst, along with Washington DC.
Interesting how the best is kind of in the middle of the country. This state here, this is Arizona, right? This is quite a, I mean, this is somewhere that I would imagine if you were looking to move to a new state, this is probably something to take a look at. Well, maybe.
When it comes to the population's characteristics, this map shows us the counties where non-Caucasian people have a high percentage of the population. Both coasts have a high population of Caucasians. Some locations where people of Asian descent are more common, although there are a lot more of these in the east than the west, but the real difference is in the south. In California, there is a high presence of people of Latino or Hispanic descent, something that is only common in South Florida, while the remainder of the southern East Coast has a high prevalence of African American people.
I've heard that California, like Spanish is pretty much like the unofficial second language of the state. A lot of people speak Spanish there, a lot of Latinos there. Is that true?
Well, this other map focused on metropolitan areas shows us how there are many more in the east compared to the west. Regarding religion, there are a lot of non-Hispanic Catholics in the northeast, but also across all the west coast. Hispanic Catholics are very present in South California as well. African American Protestants are almost exclusive to the southern east coast, while non-Hispanic Protestants are pretty much overwhelmingly the majority across the east coast, but also very present in Oregon and Washington. In this type of videos, we usually compare army sizes. Obviously, we can't do that here. With regions of the same country, they have the same army. But we can look at how many people are enlisted per state in this map.
I reckon the East Coast is going to have more people.
That becomes evident. The East Coast clearly has more enlisted personnel than the West, which makes sense because they have more population. A lot of these maps end up showing us the whole of the US states, but I try to focus on the comparison between the ones on the two coasts, since that's what this video is about. So, that is how the east and west coasts of the United States compare in a few topics. Geographically, territorially, but also in other indicators like population, development, cost of living, GDP, among many others that shows us all the aspects in which the two sets of states differ. The comparison is a little unfair in some aspects. Despite their size being similar, the East has way more states and way more people than the West, and it was settled and developed much earlier in history.
So it has a bit of an advantage.
The West has been able to surpass it in a few of these indicators. Are there any other comparisons?
Really interesting comparison. I would never have put South Carolina, Georgia, states like that into, I would never have categorized them as East Coast. And another thing, it's really interesting that, California has just exploded and become this behemoth of a state in terms of its GDP. I wonder why, because I would never the stock exchanges in New York. So there's a lot of money, a huge amount of money flowing through New York. California, apart from Hollywood, I can't really think of any other huge industries that are there, like at least, to my knowledge. Maybe, I'm guessing startups, there must be a huge amount of companies. Actually, I think Apple is headquartered in California. I'm trying to think of any other companies as well. But the thing is, a lot of companies I've heard are leaving California for other states like Texas. So I wonder if, the GDP of California will fall in the near future. It's a really fascinating video. New York, obviously amazing, like in terms of its opportunity and things like that, and considering it's quite small compared to California and Texas, it's doing really well financially, but yeah, it must be super expensive to live there considering the population is really high, whereas the pure square footage seems quite low. Yeah, really interesting video, a lot to take from this. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.